The Anderson Language and Technology Center at CU Boulder is committed to broadening and deepening cultural understanding. Alltech offers non-credit language classes in person and remotely to everyone year-round. Our flexible and engaging format makes language learning a breeze for anyone. So join a community of like-minded and motivated students who are passionate about traveling and experiencing the world. Jump into our summer session with a 20% discount using the code ALLTECHFUN. Learn more at alltech.colorado.edu.
Hi, I'm Alex Valancourt, and I'm a senior here at CU Boulder studying international affairs. This year, I've worked with a group of students and community leaders to put together this panel on art, activism, and action, and I'm so excited for you to hear from our four amazing panelists. They each bring a unique and important perspective to the table when it comes to translating art and activism into substantive action. Thank you for listening in and enjoy the panel.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining the CU Boulder Conference on World Affairs virtual panel titled Art, Activism, Action. I am Melissa Fathman, Executive Director of the Dairy Arts Center here in Boulder, Colorado. And as a performer, educator, and now administrator, I have witnessed many times the communicative powers of the arts in all of its various forms. And with that said, I am extremely humbled by this impressive group of individuals and their wide and varied forms of talent and skills, interests, and awards. Before I introduce them to you, though, a couple things I want you all to be aware of. All of the CWA panels are being recorded and are available to watch immediately after the event on the CWA YouTube channel. And although the Q&A section is at the very end, please feel free to submit your questions anytime during this event, even now, if you've already read up on some of these people and want to and have a question. So put your questions in through the YouTube chat feature, and our behind-the-scenes helpers will be collating all of those. So don't worry if they scroll past, we'll get them all. And if you're a CU student, we invite you to let us know that. We want to know who you are and also where you're joining from. You know, this is a virtual world now, and so many of you are probably not in Boulder, Colorado, so let us know. As a special feature after the panel, as I'm sure this topic is with our guests is going to spark a lot of conversation and interest, we invite you all to join us for a Zoom discussion after the panel. The link for that will be in the chat also. Space is limited, so sign up as soon as you can, and we look forward to you joining us for that. Since I only have time for very quick introductions before each of these people, I highly recommend that you not only read their full bios on the CWA website, but use your favorite search engine to dig a little deeper into what they have created and what they're currently working on. As I said, these are amazing individuals, and we can only scratch the surface in what we do here today. So check them out in more detail. So I'm going to go through and introduce each person, and they will then do their 5 minutes of opening remarks. And we're going to start with Diksha Bijlani. She is an internationally acclaimed spoken word poet from India and a public policy graduate from Harvard's Kennedy School. She currently works in climate change at the World Bank. And the focus of her poetry ranges from from toxic TV culture and the glorification of the English language in post-colonial countries to reclaiming the right to dissent, to mental health issues such as high-functioning depression. I checked out her performances of her poetry, and I highly recommend that you do the same by clicking on the links in her bio. I was just mesmerized by her rapid fire pace of, she packs so much meaning into each line and just takes us on this journey toward this crescendo at the end, and left me in awe. So we are lucky that she's actually going to be performing one of her poems now. So welcome, Diksha, and whenever you're ready, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. I am really grateful to be here today. I think since I'm also performing a poem, what I'll do is I'll keep my opening remarks short, which is basically, an overview of how I approach activism, and then I can perform the poem. It's important to say when we talk about activism, I think it's important to realize that we can't club activism of sort of one verb, one thing that we do, because to me, there's at least two kinds of activism. One is the activism of lived experience, an activism where we have been through, we speak for the community because those are our stories, And this is a kind of activism where you're living through it. So it's your reality nonetheless. I mean, if you're a woman, you are affected by patriarchy, whether you speak about it or not. And this is, it also applies to things like climate change, which we are all doomed by, or nuclear warfare for that matter, And it's important to realize that in these sorts of activism, when you use your art, it's okay if you're getting the recognition and you're becoming sort of the face of the movement, because these are your stories after all. But the second kind of activism, which I'm hoping I will talk more about in this panel, is the activism of allyship, which is where you don't have the lived experience. In fact, it gets trickier when you are the part of the oppressor community and you have actively gained and you've been privileged from the oppression because it's sort of more systemic. And about this kind of activism, I think it's important to remember, one, that we don't do it out of a place of charity, but out of a place of justice, because you can't change history, but you can, change the historical wrongs that have been done. And the second thing that's important to remember about this kind of activism is not to center yourself. You can't become the face of that movement because these aren't your stories. And tied to that, especially in the culture of social media, is the very important link of like who is centering themselves in the narrative. Is it the people whose stories they are, or is it you? And who is capitalizing off it? Who is capitalizing off of those stories? And it's also important, like in spoken word poetry, we have this phrase, kind of a radical phrase that says, stay in your lane, poet. And then the more moderates say that, you don't have to be the voice for the voiceless if you can just pass the mic. And in the age of social media, it becomes easier to pass the mic, I would say. And so it's important for us to talk about the activism of allyship, because an ally isn't something we can claim ourselves to be. An ally is, to me, it's a tag that's won from the community on behalf of which we fight. And so those are, kind of my two overarching themes of what I would want to talk about today. I will perform a poem, given the demise of Prince Philip and all the condolences that have been pouring out and how triggering it's been for people in post-colonial countries. I thought it would only be fitting for me to perform a poem on post-colonial hangover. And for those of you who don't know, spoken word poetry, it's basically an art form where the poet performs something, writes something for the sole purpose of performing it. So it can have more gesticulation. It's sort of like a more freestyle art form where the stories are at the center. And as long as you have a story to tell, the literary prowess is kind of secondary. The language is just the medium to tell the story. So moving on to the poem, after which we can just go to the next speaker directly. It's called Translated Disney. And like I said, it's about post-colonial hangovers. I grew up watching Translated Disney. In Translated Disney, the Hannah Montana show had an Indian theme song. So we never really heard Miley Cyrus singing. We just saw her groove to the backdrop of our ironical translation of Best of Both Worlds without knowing another version even existed. And the High School Musical movie was like a social experiment in knowing all the tunes without knowing any of the original lyrics. And when they had Harry Potter movies, they'd go a step ahead and change names of characters, like Moaning Myrtle became Mayus Meena, and I did not know then that identities could be lost in translation. But the first time I saw Lizzie McGuire in English, lip sync perfect, like the taste of cheese on cherry wine tongue, I felt like I had known a different character all along. Maybe that's how you'd feel if I shed foreign syllables from my mouth like spaghetti and slip into the nightgown of my mother tongue today. My mother does not understand English. And frankly, there's no other language I'm competent enough to write poetry in. At McDonald's, her mind is a probable Kim Possible, secretly asking me to place her order because she won't fumble with extra large if she never talks right. My mother is not mother, but the Phineas and Ferb of our house, the genius of two in one woman alone, the smartest woman I know. Until she is put through translation. Then she is every Facebook comment put through my literary council before being posted online. Her longest comment till now is God bless you. She knows this phrase. She also knows the English names for all my achievements because haven't they always come from proving I know my second language better than my first? A rancid murmur in my ear that says we will call you a poet, not a traitor. I'm a descendant of a family of multilingual folk who are synonymous to non-English speaking, who sent me to English school so I could be better than them. Because speaking English in India is status. English in India is, look, I have a verbal Mercedes. English in India is sucking up to the colonialist, but forgetting they left a long time ago, the first time I dated a white guy. I would sometimes let words from my native language slip into our texts out of reflex, and he dismissed them as typos. What a beginning for a classically conditioned fear of words too brown for love. I've seen my accent curl around the edges in front of people who own this language, every her becoming a her, every thank you becoming a thank you. This is not conformity, this is surrender. How I cannot write this poem in anything but English so you would understand it. Is this burden of proof or already found guilty? Somewhere, a generation of millennials is debating what language to call their first when they haven't spoken the other in years. They say we feel things in the language we speak, think in the language we speak. So maybe my feelings are dual. Maybe my thoughts are dual too. Maybe I am in two parts and I can never be whole until I let go of one of my identities. Maybe America is 500,000 immigrants, but 1 million identities. Maybe I am a Disney lost in translation, a Disney on display, and two countries know different versions of me. You don't get the best of both worlds when one world rules your other. Maybe I have just one world and the other drags along. Because, darling, how can you keep the story when you change the theme song? We all know how the Jungle Book ended. Sometimes where you were born is not where you belong. When the syllables rolling off your tongue get tangled, be brave and shoot the bear behind you and wish with all of your heart that if we get one last prayer, God make it languageless, make it meaning that does not tell words or worth. Because somewhere in La La Land, Emma Stone will say, my aunt used to live in Paris. I remember she used to come home and she would tell us, and it'll always be relevant what her aunt told her. When her words are spilled from a white carpet to red, and they'll give it laurels of golden plated ladies looking like they're already defending themselves. Everybody's celebrating the movie and not the language of privilege it comes from. You know, maybe 50 years later, our kids will ask us, Mom, how do white people make themselves so big we all look small? How do they do it? And we'll tell them, kid, first you burn the whole world down, bring it to its knees, then pretend to put out the flames, make fire extinguishing a profession. They'll call you prince, and they'll never remember who lit the fire. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Thank you. I look forward to talking about allyship with you in the next section. A lot of the arts leaders in Boulder are working on that, and we have an Indigenous artist program. And anyway, I won't talk now, but there's so much to talk about. Thank you so much for that. So the next speaker we have is Elena Gaby. She's a Brooklyn-based film director and producer known for her documentary filmmaking. including her award-winning sci-fi documentary, which I have to admit gave me pause, since I've never actually thought of putting those two words together. Sci-fi documentary. It's titled I Am Human, and it follows 3 of the world's first cyborgs as they receive brain-computer interfaces. And also, prior to her many accomplishments in film and television and her growing career, Elena studied film at Vassar College, and while she was there, she embedded with 4 undocumented teenagers as they navigated the path to college. And that work won Best Student Documentary at the Cannes Film Festival. So welcome, Elena, and feel free to take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Conference of World Affairs, for having me. Thank you, Diksha, for that incredibly moving work that you just shared with us. I want to hear it 10 more times. I feel like there was so much in there that I was jotting things down. But some of the themes that I think you talked about are things that I want to extend upon, and certainly this idea in art where sometimes you are from the community of people who you're representing, and many times you are not. And so I will talk a little bit more about that as well. As a filmmaker, I've worked on films with topics that are deeply close to me, and I've also worked on films where I knew nothing about the topic prior to embarking on the journey of making the film. In either case, I believe that as a filmmaker, my job is to work my absolute hardest to help build bridges between the mainstream audiences that are going to watch the film and the subjects who are sharing their story in front of the camera. I use films as this tool to introduce mainstream audiences to people and issues that they may not have otherwise been exposed to, or may have had a very narrow understanding of. I believe that in a dark movie theater with a big screen and no distractions, audiences can be more open to truly listening. And I believe that through great storytelling, we as artists can collaborate with a subject to present and amplify their story in an engaging way in order to bring an audience through an emotional experience and hold their hand as they begin to see the issue through a lens that they may not have previously considered. I find that when people allow themselves to really feel their emotions and explore a journey emotionally with someone together, they can start to think differently about their biases and what they thought they knew about an issue. What are some of the best examples out there of building these bridges? For me, the 2020 documentary Disclosure by Sam Feder, I did not work on it. I had nothing to do with the production, but to me, it is a gold standard of art as activism in filmmaking. It looks at trans representation in Hollywood films and explains that 80% of Americans don't personally know someone who is transgender, meaning their only exposure to transgender people would have been through media, which historically has done a terrible job depicting trans lives on screen. The film combats negative representations, not only through breaking down the specific examples, but by introducing the audience to an entirely trans and non-binary cast who were filmed by a largely trans and non-binary crew. In this case, the filmmakers were members of the community that they were representing, and that added to the film's power and impact, and ultimately the film's contribution to the movement, which I believe is very great. But what about when a filmmaker comes to the topic as an outsider, which is more common, given the fact that most filmmakers are often white and male, especially in documentary, although that is changing, and I hope it continues to change. In these cases, I have found for me personally that practicing what Buddhist scholar Thich Nhat Hanh calls deep listening is very, very important when we come to these issues. This is a kind of selfless, compassionate listening without judging or reacting, and without having preconceived notions that can bring about healing if employed in the right way. He writes that you have to listen in such a way that compassion remains with you the whole time you are listening. That is the art. Often I enter a subject's life in their most dramatic and vulnerable moments, which are also the moments that they most need to be listened to. If we ourselves as filmmakers are not practicing deep, compassionate listening, how can we expect the subject to have a positive experience sharing their story? How can we expect the audience to deeply listen to that subject in the final film? We can't be an effective translator if we never truly heard the message. And that's, of course, if we are the person who should be the one translating that message at all, which we can talk about more. And this relates to what Diksha said about you don't have to be a voice for the voiceless when you can pass the mic. So we can talk more about how you determine what your role should be in these situations. My first film, which Melissa mentioned, was based off of a profound experience of deep listening. Kenneth, my now husband, was my boyfriend at the time and had immigrated from Costa Rica at 10 years old and spent the next decade with undocumented status. By listening to his experiences, I learned that as the daughter of an immigrant myself, there was still so much I didn't know about our broken system. And my film, Paper State, reflected that as I followed undocumented students trying to make their way to college. I felt I had done my job when the screenings took place. The subjects of the film felt empowered and validated by seeing themselves on screen. It helped motivate them to continue their activism and to share their story in more ways, even broader. At the same time, audiences from across the country and around the world were able to come up to me and say, honestly, that they had no idea about these stories and that they were so grateful that they now knew about these stories when they thought about the issues of immigration. That is the bridge building power of documentaries that I would like to discuss further and I think play a role in activism. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elena. Next, we have Asher J. She is a painter, sculptor, installation artist, animator, explorer, and I'm sure lots of many other things from what I've gathered from her bio and even just speaking with her before this panel. But all of these pursuits, or many of them, seem to be laser beam focused on her global action activism on behalf of wildlife conservation, including, and to put it bluntly, stopping wildlife trafficking. And, you know, I express it this way because her ability to essentially throw cold water on our faces with an image, you know, to say, wake up, realize people are killing elephants for their tusks. You know, it was just incredibly impactful that so much can be expressed in an image. She's described her pursuits as using art as a weapon. She uses sensorially evocative visual discourse that transcends normative communication barriers. I just love that sentence. And I, again, urge you to take the time to look at her work. Her graphic designs just absolutely speak more powerfully than words themselves. She's also more recently, currently scaling her impact by building and creating and founding a tech company called Hive and Hamlet. I definitely want to hear more about this. And my understanding of it is that it serves as an interactive hub of applications intended to make information such as consumer behaviors and all kinds of things more accessible to the public, to empower us to make our own choices in the marketplace, so that we're aware of what's happening with some of these products that we may choose to purchase or not, which is a powerful tool in this age of activism through buying practices. So her goal is to make efforts like hers less strenuous for the next generation. So welcome, Asher, and go ahead.
Hi, pleasure to be here, and really enjoyed Deeksha's spoken poetry. I think that was so powerful. And many of the remarks made, I'm just going to translate that into things I'm going to be adding on to and saying. So primarily, the reason why I entered the discourse through visual media is because I think an image translates across boundaries and barriers that language, culture can prevent point of entry for. And the way you have to be sensitive to content when you're disseminating it, especially through mass media conduits, which has been my primary purpose, is to reclaim or claim for the first time ever mass media channels that have been used by corporations for messaging, or government even for messaging, and it is still bias that is being sold, and it is an agenda that allows for a certain paradigm to be perpetuated that isn't necessarily empowering of the masses. They say it is, but it's not. And actually what they're doing is having a top-down approach, pandering to the lowest common denominator. And it's not really a moment of empowerment. What it actually does is it allows the people to stagnate and think that what they're participating in is actually helping them when it isn't. It's taking away, because it's also taking away from the larger context, which we have lost sight of because we've been told that all we need to focus on is ourselves, and therefore that erodes into the larger premise of planet. So both people and planet are suffering, and the people who are talking to us and talking through these specific channels or conduits aren't necessarily leveraging them to get us out of the status quo, right? It just keeps us where we are. And so my primary function has always been to disrupt that, or to intercept that and claim it as a moment of by the people, for the people, to truly democratize data and enable and empower access to real world conversations that need to be enlisting everyone and not be happening behind closed doors. You know, having been in this line of work of being an activist or being in the conservation sphere, it's pretty impressive that to date, for whether it's sustainable brands, whether it's larger dialogues that are happening on a congressional level between different governments, between different agencies, I'm always behind closed doors with these people, and that conversation never leaves that room in real time to allow people that conversation is likely to impact to be a part of it, which is bizarre, because then you go out and you feed these conclusions to the masses and say this is the way it's going to be, instead of saying, hey, let's have this mutual conversation here where your input, your feedback from being present in the region that we plan to express this concluded statement in, or course of action in, that you have a voice that should be heard and listed as part of the solution set, not something that is handed over right at the end. And so for me, every time I've created a work, it's been to allow that moment of dialogue to occur early on, to be proactive instead of always being in a space of mitigation, where you have to go back and do in a retrospective, desperate measure, a half-assed, a hack that, like, you're like, oh, now I've gone back and I'm like, I have to cover my bases for what I have not accounted for. And we're always lacking that level of accountability when we're not allowing everyone to be part of those moments of decision making and discussion. And so with every single image I've created, I wanted to condense the most amount of information in the simplest iteration possible, juxtaposing what is familiar to us against what isn't familiar to the layperson who may not otherwise be part of this conversation just because they've never been enlisted. And I use the word enlisted because, it is a matter of knowing that you're even a stakeholder. They don't even let you know that. So you don't know that you belong, and therefore you just never participate. So people think that's ignorance, but I think it's more about the fact that you've just never been given the context. You don't know where you should be showing up because it's not been a part of your narrative arc, and that's been very carefully curated and presented to you. And because it benefits people to keep you out in the sidelines. And so with every single image I've created, and you can look up every one of my examples, either on talks that I've given at National Geographic or on my website, a lot of it has been primarily focused on wildlife, because I'm very personally passionate about animals and natural ecosystems, because it is the tragedy of the commons, and they are the number one thing that we take for granted. If you look at the global biomass, 97% of it is human. It's our footprint, it's our agricultural crops, it's our livestock, it's everything that we've given risen to, and only 3% of that is wildlife, which is bizarre. Think about the size of redwood forests and whales, and they still occupy only 3% of the biomass. And that should put into perspective how much we've eclipsed in favor of just ourselves, whilst being completely oblivious of the fact that we're utterly interdependent and dependent on the services offered by these wild organisms that are so different from us, that are so alien in their countenance. And I think the reason why we take it for granted is because it's out of sight, out of mind. You get so entrenched in your everyday way of being, dropping your kids off at school, whatever it is, whether it's your career path, whether you're a student, you end up doing you, and you forget that you're part of this whole system, that you have an active voice and state in. And it's up to you to be conscious of the fact that this impact that you have daily, whether it's brushing your teeth and you spit a particular brand of toothpaste down your sink, all of that goes back out into the world and impacts countless other living organisms. So the greater your sensitivity, the sooner you start cultivating that within you, the more likely you are to come as an informed, able participant in this overall conversation, that you actually choose to engage yourself daily, every step of the way, in every course of impact that you could be having. So, I mean, for me, when I wake up, I'm responsible for the whole world, because my sphere of influence, my sphere of impact does have those ripples, because I don't acquire products just from my local market. It's not just from my farm in the backyard right now. I get some products that come all the way from Asia, and I don't even know that if I don't choose to inform myself of that, right? So I think part of the reason why I've moved from exploration to entrepreneurship is to make that kind of connections more accessible to the masses, so people know where they're getting their things from, and that they can be held more accountable to how they show up, but that they also have the power to hold these larger agencies, these larger conversations that are happening behind closed doors accountable to them. As consumers, every single dollar we spend impacts the world around us. And I think each of us needs to be utterly mindful of where we put our dollar, because that's how we're voting, that's how we're showing up. And I'm going to continue using visual media to educate people, and to help them feel empowered and participate in these conversations, only because it is an extension of their voice too. In assimilating as much as I can from everyone around me, I'm able to stand for something that is larger than the self. And I think visual media allows a person to truly enable that sort of inclusive, mindful access. And and that extends across, whether it's through a startup or through mass media campaigning. I think it comes down to the same premise, is like, why do you do what you do? What does it truly stand for? And is that integrity rooted in the collective well-being, or is it just about your personal agenda? And the minute it's just about you, you've already lost sight of the whole. And while every role matters, I think the whole should be accounted for first and foremost. So with that, I would like to give it back to the panel.
Great. Thank you so much, Asher. I want to, before we get on to a group discussion here, we had another panelist. It appears he's not able to join, so we're gonna move forward. And also, just to remind everyone, please start submitting questions now, so that we can kind of collate them for the end of the event. But I'd love to just kind of kick things off with a discussion on allyship. I know, Diksha, that you brought that up specifically, and in this country, of course, we moved through so many tragedies of African-American people being murdered by law enforcement. And, the urgency of the Black Lives Matter movement became even more, crystal clear to many people who were maybe not as aware. And, the original message back in the summer was silence is violence. So there was this, you can't not say it, it's time to do something. And so, and then that kind of led to, but what, you don't want to tell someone else's story, but at the same time wanting to know what to do. So I would just love to kind of throw that general concept out there for anyone who wants to jump in.
I can certainly jump in, because I think I also want to respond to some of the wonderful, remarks that were made, because, you say that silence it is indeed. And like I said, we need to do it from a place of justice, not charity. I think that it's important to structure how we talk about allyship. One, of course, is the extreme end where, even in the spoken word poetry space, we were seeing all these people go ahead and do something called persona poems, which was basically like a white woman going and performing a poem about being a Black person and a Black experience, and of course, capitalizing of it. I mean, that goes without saying. And people were saying that you can't do persona poems because then you're just capitalizing off. And we are not living in an age where you can't find a Black poet or like share a poem by a Black poet to say the same message. So that was one. And when it comes to filmmaking, of course, like I am of the view, I mean, the ideal for us, of course, in filmmaking would be that wherever trans stories are told through, I mean, that's not documentaries in terms of like movies, we cast trans stars in those roles. We don't cast people who don't have, and that's something that people have been talking about for so long. And then, the movie makers come back to us and say, but the movie is not going to get enough clout if we don't take an actor who isn't already famous. So that's the discourse on the sort of extreme end where you're merely talking about the fact that these activists exist on the ground and your job is to sort of amplify their voice, right? Because, and that's where my second point comes in, which is that when you are an ally and you're making something on behalf of people, you also, as an artist, have the power to negotiate not just with yourself, but with others as to what you feature. So not every clip goes into a documentary, right? And this is especially important when we talk about climate change, because climate change affects all of us, but when we talk about climate change, there are some especially vulnerable stakeholders, which is the indigenous people, right? Whose voices we don't hear. And a lot of times we saw many climate activists go ahead and negotiate and kind of de-radicalize their stances. So instead of going out at corporations, they would just say, "This is wrong. This is a sort of moderate statement I'm making that we use less plastic." All of which, by the way, is very important. But where as allies or even as activists, are we willing to, put the stop line on our on how far we go? Like, are we going to call out corporations or are we not? When you throw money into the pot and you commercialize something, I think that that's the easiest way to moderate someone's politics. And when it comes to allyship, it's because it doesn't pertain to us, it's easier for us to, we're more vulnerable to de-radicalize our politics. And that's the main point that I was trying to make, that even when it comes to climate activism, people have been calling, there have been indigenous climate leaders who have been calling out, because you go on the ground and you see there's so much deep understanding of how everything is systemic, but then they see themselves represented in some Netflix documentary, and that documentary and in fact that documentary is funded by an oil company. And this is just, these are not people are talking in the air here, these are real examples. So I really appreciate the work that Elena and Asha are doing in this regard, because it's important to talk about these things, because these people need to be supported as well. You are doing your activism to also inform and inspire. You aren't just doing it from a place of that I have power and I know more, so I should be. The ideal, I think, should be to become an invisible medium where you're not amplifying your own voice, even if you have the compassion to do it, even if you're deeply listening, you're amplifying the person who's affected, their voices instead of yours. I think that's sort of the negotiation power and the representing the real, casting the real superstars should be at the forefront of what we talk about.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm curious to hear, Elena, your response, because it's true. As a documentarian, you have a lot of power in how things are told and what clips, as you said, they show what clips are used and or not. And so, yeah, I'm just curious about your
Absolutely. That was so eloquently said. Thank you, Diksha. And absolutely. I mean, I think with documentary, one positive is that we are featuring real people. And with my personal work, I don't do voiceover narration. I don't, I really try to enter with the philosophy that I am listening first, and later I am collaborating with the subject. So we are working together the entire time to understand what it is that you want to say about what you're going through, what it is that I find compelling in, and maybe something that based on my research hasn't been out there before in this way. And together we can come up with ideas of how to show that. So with I Am Human, my film about the cyborgs, which is kind of the kitschy sci-fi term, but really what we were looking at was how do future technologies, specifically in brain-computer interfaces, get cast in media, which is often this very like dystopian future of sci-fi fantasy, and we're all going to be controlled by our technology. And on the real world and on the ground, what I was seeing was that this is actually an incredible tool to help empower folks who have neurological conditions like Parkinson's and things like that, where they actually could benefit greatly if they choose to look at these interfaces as an option. And so when collaborating with a woman who had Parkinson's chronically and had surgically implanted this device in her brain, we talked at great length until I felt confident that I knew what it was that she wanted to highlight about her story. And we discussed ways to bring that on camera. What should we film you doing to show that? What would you like expressed? These are all questions that come with the preparation. And if you're really listening and if you're really collaborating with the person, you will get to that moment where they're at the premiere and they watch the film for the first time and they're so you really just bond over it. It's like this incredible thing when it's done well, that I'm trying to express this because it really is so emotional when you get to that place where you feel like this person was really truly happy with the way that you depicted them, and getting to that end game is worth all of the extra effort, all of the extra conversations, all of the extra mistakes that you might make and be corrected on, and you should be open to being corrected for those mistakes. So I think that I'm trying to be hopeful and positive where there is a way to do this right and do this correctly, and so that people don't walk out feeling like, well, if I'm not a part of a marginalized community, I can't participate, because that's not, that is absolutely not the message that I want to convey. I think that the goal is, how do you do it mindfully, and how do you do it in a way where, as Diksha said, you're not centering your own interpretation of that story before you've really heard and learned what it is that the person you're working with wants to tell about it. And then oftentimes with the money part, somebody else is funding it, and then it's a question of how can my piece of this cog in this great machine do as much as I possibly can to make sure that I steer this ship in every little way that I can towards the way that I need to, even if I don't have control over the full outcome of the project.
Yeah, there's a related question I have, and it's that fine line between supporting, well, maybe it's not such a fine line, but between supporting a movement and capitalizing off of it. You talked about funding, and I know, Asher, you're involved in the marketplace and how buying power and those sorts of things.
I definitely wanted to jump in also on the previous question. So, and since the two tie in together, so there's three examples I can think of. One is when I was working with Guatemalan women through Care Guatemala, and we were trying to empower them to get rid of the middlemen because they couldn't retail their products to the American market without having other people to go through. And so they were taking a huge cut or commission off of the product and merchandise that these artisan women were trying to sell to earn a revenue for their abilities, for their skill sets on the ground. And they were doing these extraordinary beaded, jewelry lines and things like that. And it was just not getting the acclaim, and they didn't know how to brand and market their products directly. And that's because they're lacking that educational infrastructure, And so being a Parsons grad, I was asked to go and work with them and figure out a way to communicate branding and marketing to them. And and people like to say that, certain types of education is limited to a certain vocabulary and it can only be dispensed over a certain course of time. So you have to endure 4 years to get a BFA or whatever in order for you to be an expert in marketing, in branding or whatever. And so I was like, how can I condense this into a 2-day workshop that's actually going to empower these women to get their product out into market and get them going forward, right? And I literally placed the entire narrative, and I don't even speak Spanish, which is like my own limitation. I'm rubbish at languages and I've tried hard and failed, and I can picture my way through the world, but that's as far as I've gotten. But like with these women, I literally wrote down these stick figures and had each of them describe themselves through attributes in Spanish and like detail how they came up with a sense of self. And I was like, it's the same thing for your product line. A sense of self is what you're imparting into your product, and just communicate that. They came up with a logo within an hour and a half. We had a brand together and they were hitting market. So I'm just saying that, like, part of it is just allowing people to have access to the educational infrastructure on terms that are worth their application, right? So like if you cannot get them to apply it quickly, then it's not profitable, it's not worth their energy and time, and therefore they're already not dispensed toward it. And so if you want to change the disposition, the only way you're going to do that is by allowing them to see the merit of learning that and allowing them to realize the impact of that learning very quickly, because they also are living need-based lifestyles. And it is a privilege to be able to go to school for 4 years and have, the capacity to come out after that and assume a job. Some people just need to be working, period. So like have the mindfulness and awareness of how education needs to translate and find application. That's one thing. The second one was, I'm always about taking the middleman out. So it was not just about this situation where a business model needed direct conduits available for sale and sell through. But like when it comes to storytelling as well, right? I ran a National Geographic assignment where I told photographers to take out the middleman, like take out the storyteller. What is the actual story? So tell it from the first person perspective of the individual or the being or the situation that is witnessing. So they will become the filter through which you're seeing the story unfold. So instead of telling me that this is the last orangutan hanging out of the last tree in Borneo, go up the tree and take a photograph from the orangutan's perspective and show the loss of landscape, right? So that's so much more powerful if you're standing in the footprint of the being whose story you're trying to tell, than being the person who's like, this is the story that I'm going to tell, but it's through my filter. So I'm all about removing those because you'd like to say, and it takes me back to like high school, where the headmaster of the school would come up and he would read an excerpt from like a philosopher's book, and then he's like, what this person meant to say. And I'd always put my hand up and be like, no, that's your interpretation. You already read what that person meant to say. Just stop there and then take ownership of what you're saying when you're mansplaining, right? So I'm like that's the thing that we're not cognizant of, is when you start putting your words into somebody else's space, when you start putting your imagery into somebody else's space. Once again, like talking about visual campaigning, when I was in China and we were campaigning for the wildlife trafficking issue of ivory and rhino horn, something as simple as I, as an external person, will not know the difference between the shades of red that will translate in an American market versus in a Chinese market. The initial red that I went in with was actually going to, sell to the Chinese demographic that buying ivory is a good thing. It's a symbol of prosperity. Please buy more, and just tweaking the red to the right shade allowed the message to change and be internalized in a completely different way. And that intuitive input came from someone on the ground. It has to come from the person who actually knows the consumer market and has worked in those colors, knows what translates where and why. And then, and working with people on the ground, and as Diksha was saying, enlisting them as allies, you're actually communicating in a language that's inherently accessible to the demographic you're trying to reach, because you're reaching them where they're at and not from where you're at, because it's all lost in translation then, as she was talking about Disney translations. So those are the 3 examples I would say is just being mindful of your language and realizing the limitations of your cultural context, your normative words, your lexicon with which you show up, where you might have a concept that just doesn't translate to another language, to another culture, right? So for instance, one of the other things I would say is like, so a quick small example was when it comes to bushmeat marketing, and we were trying to talk to Africans in Kenya and in Tanzania about why we shouldn't be buying bushmeat. Like, do not kill wildlife and eat them, kill livestock and eat that. That's better for you, right? And so, but the thing is, in Swahili, in that language, there is no word for bushmeat. It's just meat on feet. Like anything that's moving is meat on feet and you can eat it. And so they're like, what is the difference between a wildebeest and a cow? Like we can have both, right? And so going into that context, you can't go in with the Western mindset of like, no, we distinguish between wildlife and livestock, and here's how and here's why. Instead, look at it from their perspective and see why and how you can enlist them as part of the stewards of solution. Because if they see it as a benefit through ecotourism, if they see it as a microeconomy that can develop from protecting the wildebeest and then harvesting the cow, and also be sensitive to the economies that are in play, because in Africa, it's cheaper to kill a wildebeest than it is to have livestock and graze them and grow them to adulthood and be able to consume them as butchered meat. So, you know, it's just there's so many sensitivities and complexities around every issue. It's so easy to simplify and go black and white on things and be like, this is great, this is bad. But if you're really trying to make a solution possible on a source level, you have to be inclusive. You have to bring everybody into the conversation. It can't be top down. It has to be everybody part of it at the same time. So there has to be a certain level of synergy and synchronicity towards realizing that solution set. And back to the panel.
Wow, that's awesome. We do have a lot of questions coming in, but I want to make sure that you all talk with each other, as much as you'd like to respond to what you've heard.
I would just say that, it's, I think that like all of us on this panel probably, do more work on the ground to kind of stay connected to what we are talking about. But there is kind of this extraterrestrial species which has, rescinded into outer space, which is, people with influence trying to piggyback on causes. And when I say piggyback, I don't mean piggyback. I mean that they feel a pressure that given their influence, they need to also contribute to a cause. I mean, when silence became violence, a lot of people started to do that. And then because the grassroots work was missing, a lot of times you saw people co-opting movements, right? A lot of times you saw people presenting what was there. And social media just makes it easier to do it. And what I've seen happen also is that when people talk about their privilege, so if you're an ally, you think that you're talking about that your privilege and it's important, a lot of times that narrative too centers you and centers sort of the white guilt, or centers in case of India, it centers the guilt of the upper castes. And so when you're talking about your guilt as well, it's also important to think about, are not there other people who are doing that work? And can you not amplify that voice? So, just to kind of, give that foundation to this panel too, that we are people that are doing, that are connected to the causes that we speak about in our art. But and in this day and age, it's become more difficult to find out which artist is doing the grassroots work and which artist is speaking because it's opportune or because they want to posture themselves. And it's important that we remember this, because in the end of the day, this art is inspiring people. And it's also something that the people that you're speaking about are consuming. So you're not only creating the space to inspire, sort of people who are allies too, but you're also speaking and you're being consumed by people whose struggles it is that you're talking about. So it's especially important when we're talking about Israel, Palestine. It's important when we're talking about, the lower caste people in India, Black people, immigrants. All of these people are consuming your stuff too. So I think that's something that I would also just set a foundation on, that there are people who sort of co-opt worse than we can imagine. I mean, we are people who are going around and working in Africa and Guatemala, and then there's people who are sitting behind an Instagram screen and posturing themselves as this ally. And like I said before, an ally isn't something you declare yourself to be. An ally is something that the community gifts you as a title because you've done the work. And I think that's just important for us to remember.
That's great. There's questions coming in, and there's one that seems related to what you were just saying, Diksha. It's we are all so much in our own bubbles of viewpoints and sense of possibilities. Are there ways you think artistic interventions can break into these bubbles any better than other methods, and how? And anyone can answer it.
I would say that just being able to show multiple perspectives coexisting, showing diversity in real time, and that's something that you can do through art. And I think tech is another great conduit for that, is because it does allow for you to step out and show a true sliver of time that allows and accounts for as much of the whole as possible. Yes, there's still going to be some bias coming in because you are you, and it's through you that something is getting created. But that again comes with the more self-work you've done, the less baggage and bias you're bringing to the context. And so I really do think you have a deep responsibility as an individual who's particularly committed to trying to convey and stand for narratives outside of self, for something larger than self, that you've done the self-work. Because the minute you bring your own causalities into the narrative arc, then there is a thread line that you've put in place that you will not even be conscious of, that is going to get iterated over and over again. And that is a bias, that is an opinion state. So I think for me personally, you know, working through my own, like in the past, and I will take ownership of that, as in the past, I did a lot of campaigning that focused on the problem sets and was visualizing the problems continually, but didn't actually orient as much towards visualizing solutions. And that was because I myself was a cause at that point. And so for me, causes resonated deeply because I identified with them. And to get out of that mindset, I had to heal. I had to work through, and it could be anything. For me, it was just having lost my father and going through my own personal woundings, right? So for each of us who are trying to speak out for more, or at least step aside, even to have that bandwidth and compassion to step aside and pass the mic, you will not have that presence of mind, presence of being, availability, and decluttered space, real estate that you can offer for another if you are not mindful of self first. So I think, you know, doing that self-work helps you set yourself aside and take that backseat and have that conscious involvement of others in the contexts that you're participating in.
Absolutely. And I think one thing too, to distinguish, there's a lot of art forms that are mostly done on the individual level. So it's one person creating art as the autonomous author of that work, and they are the only author of that work. I imagine with poetry, that's often the case. With filmmaking, it's almost never the case. The amount of people that it takes to make even the most basic low budget film is exponentially higher than in many other art forms. So with filmmaking, my question often to myself is, how can we get the most diverse team possible involved in the actual filmmaking, so that even if there are biases that I most definitely have as a Brazilian American white person who grew up mostly in the United States, but also has Brazilian citizenship and lives between two cultures, that's one lens that I can bring to the team. But that no matter how much self-work I do, and no matter how much reading and listening I do, I will never be able to spot something that a person who belongs to that community will spot immediately. And my job then is to recruit those team members to increase the chances that we are going to be able to catch problematic depictions before they ever go out into the world, and before we have to do the backtracking that Asher was speaking about, where all of a sudden you lose the ability to make the productive contribution that you wanted to, and instead you're in a defensive position, which makes it a lot harder to move forward in a productive way, though again, not impossible. And if you make mistakes, there are ways to deal with that too, and addressing them.
And also because of art's like innate ability to humanize anything, right? I mean, what is polarization? Of course, polarization oftentimes is just, people saying technical things that are all true in their own way. Like one can't change history the same way one can't change, sometimes one can't change facts either, apparently. But, art just humanizes things. And I think that's arts, if an informed artist does it, if an artist who's taken their time to really come to terms and do the work on the self, as Asha talked about, and include the diverse perspectives, if it is an art form, indeed that is made within a group, then I think because of its ability to humanize things, art can kind of build, bridge that chasm of polarization that we see today.
It moves the audience from an intellectual debate mindset to an emotional human mindset where they're just, and that's why I say sitting in a dark theater where you're not maybe worried about what people are looking at you, maybe you cry at something you never thought would have moved you to that point. You're up close and personal with this big face on the screen, and nobody's going to come save you from just listening to what they have to say. And the ability that has to break through whatever, oh, my cat's food just came out. What the ability that has to break through that debate mindset is so profound. And I think it just catches people off guard, and it puts them in that space where they just can't help but feel connected because it's coming from an emotional level. And that's what I think skilled filmmakers, poets, artists, graphic designers can bring to the table, where our expertise is in story construction, our expertise is in the medium, and we can help, use those skills to make these voices heard.
I completely agree. I mean, the perfect example is affirmative action, right? Like whether it be for lower caste in India or even for, on racial basis in the US, people who very soundly made technical arguments to talk against affirmative action and reservations were like, it's a merit-based world. And they would often draw up class, they would often say, okay, what about this poor white person compared to this sort of better off Black person? What makes you think that, this person? So it's on technically it sounds right because you're in that sea of opinions too. But when you really construct the story of a Black person's life and how, despite their class, they might go through discrimination, you humanize the aspect of discrimination that you're trying to. I mean, affirmative action was never about class. It was always about it wasn't about opportunity either. It was about historical wrongs, right? And it's important, and the contribution that artists have made to the affirmative, to making affirmative action accepted is through stories. I mean, of course there've been technical arguments that see the representation, see these numbers aren't adding up. But I think what really made a difference was when people saw, okay, my Black friends have gone through this all their lives. I mean, I haven't even spoken to them about it. People don't have these difficult conversations, but then art leaves it bare in your face, and then you do it, right? So of course, I completely agree that the debate versus the real story element is what art contributes to any revolution.
Yeah, and we're also not creatures of reason, as much as we'd like to say that we're driven by like statistics and data. When have you ever seen a number and been like, oh yeah, that's going to get me to like take the next action? It's because you love you, it's because you care. And I think when you present it through the channel of art, no matter whether it's written, spoken, performed, or illustrated, it has such a raw impact. It's real, it's raw, and it's one-to-one. You're sort of immersed in it sensorially, and since it's so tangible, since it's so tactile, it becomes such an implicit part of your fabric of being in that instant. It's an encounter, it's an experience. It's not something that's just read and has to be assimilated through understanding. You don't have to work it out all at the same moment. And you don't try to work out poetry. You don't try to work out works of art. You just enjoy them, and you internally and intrinsically imbibe aspects of them, and they click into place over time. So anytime I've created a campaign even, there's been epiphanies embedded in the work, but there's never been a stock, this is what it is. And that's up to your willingness to participate in that dialogue in that time and see what it is that you're willing to be receptive to within it. And that's what you leave with. And that's what we leave with anyway, because even in a conversation, I'm only listening to the parts that I know resonate with my understandings already. So I'm already coming into this with my polarized perspective. So it's really interesting to see, like I remember this one time I was talking to a woman in Africa, and she was like, I was like, oh, that's so funny. I wouldn't think that that's you. And then she's like, but you only know me in regards to you. You don't know how I am with someone else and someone else. And that's really what it is. It's like when you're seeing the whole of anybody or anything, they're encountered by so many, and that sum total makes up the experience of that being. So So how on earth can just one dialogue, one moment of intersection with that narrative be enough? It can't, you know, and I think that's part of the willingness we all need to have, sort of the tolerance, compassion, acceptance of even these forms of storytelling, which is that it's portraying something within a context, within a frame of time. It's not the sweeping overall be-all end-all statement on that topic or that person or any of that. I think it's a continuity, and all we're doing is advancing that dialogue. We're allowing you to take another step forward into it and find greater emotion into it. But yeah, I think we all occupy different slivers or moments of these larger stories that we get to experience, witness, and be a part of, have the privilege to be a part of.
Right, and how important this type of dialogue is to get us to the next step. That's another question. It's related to that. Can you discuss examples of how art combined with facilitated civic discourse has built social cohesion? Like they say, like in Eastern Europe with Soviet statue removal, and they say we need this type of thing in the US right now.
You know, I wanted to add to that and ask you guys, especially Alana and Diksha, like what you thought about what was happening with the Confederate statues, you know, because we had a similar thing happen right here in our backyard. So would love to see what you guys had think about that.
Absolutely. And what was the question from the student once more? And then I can kind of see what I can put together here.
Oh, the one I just mentioned, or there's another student question. It was just discussing examples of how art combined with facilitated civic discourse has built social cohesion.
Oof, I'm thinking. Well, I can say that it's never enough to just consume the piece, right? We can consume the piece and that helps us maybe feel something, maybe pique our interest, but then really in the conversations after is when that starts to meld, and especially if people can meet each other in person, as this conference would be doing if it were not for COVID. And I think that in any situation when art can start a dialogue, we should not expect the work of art to also be what finishes the dialogue. You know, as artists, we belong in a certain role that is intrinsically linked with all of these other roles. And I think no one group should be expected to kind of do that work on their own. I think they need to be in dialogue together, and that includes with the audience as well.
And I want to add, like, you know, in my own perspective, for me, I define art as design. I don't really think of it as art for art's sake. For me, it's very application driven, and there has to be a reason for its existence. I don't think a painting should be just for the sake of a painting. I mean, we've gone past that time. I think there was an era where that kind of beauty could just be appreciated for its own intrinsic value. I don't think it's responsible to be doing that anymore, to be producing anything that doesn't serve a greater purpose, because it's resources extraction perspective. What is the problem set? What is the most efficient solution you can come up with that reconciles form and function towards a moment of you're choosing the right medium at the right time with the right primary intention for being. And intentionality and directionality are two things that it's from the perspective who got to tell the story and how do they get to tell it, and how much of a footprint does that story occupy, is very interesting to compete with, because then as we evolve past those previous points and perspectives and like points of view and perspective, because it's no longer sensitive to the whole. And I think that's a really like interesting space to be in. I don't know for sure if I've had a consensus on whether we should be taking the history down, because I do think, you know, we shouldn't be erasing something that has happened, because we should learn from those markers of negligence and ignorance that have been resurrected in the past, because there's a reason we went through that lesson, and have we really assimilated that lesson? Because if we take it all away, then it creates another blind spot. So I do believe that we should rectify and ensure we're being inclusive in how we have told our history and who's gotten to tell our history, and therefore who's getting to tell our present and future. But in including those voices, I don't think we should like try to erase history and erase what has been, because then we're losing sight of that continuity that is so critical to our continued awareness and growth of consciousness. So that's what I would say for that.
But then also, I mean, when we are talking about, dialogue, I think it's important to talk about power. I mean, dialogue is an ideal, and it would be great if we were coming from equal places of power. But for people who, actively benefit from the status quo, a dialogue probably could be symbolic. A dialogue could be, I'm doing something without doing anything. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, it may seem like a dialogue is merely a delay, and so because when I was at Harvard and I was working, I was not working. I mean, I shouldn't say working. I was studying the Israel-Palestine conflict and trying to write academically about what could be done. I had come across this very interesting paper of social cohesion amongst Israelis and Palestinians. And what the researchers did was they placed these people in groups of 5, and they said, okay, now what we are trying to do is amongst these groups of 5, we are trying to model how we kind of make dialogue and make them like each other. And later on, they found out that all the Palestinians reported that they found there was some inherent like power imbalance where they were trying to seek approval, but it was at the behest of the Israeli masters to give it per se. And the Israelis were like, it was chill. I mean, we liked it. It was nice. So one has to remember that social cohesion is a goal, but it is only a goal once we're at equalized levels of power. And a lot of times, this dialogue can mask what's really wrong. I mean, you make 2 Israeli-Palestinian artists collaborate. I mean, poets collaborate all the time, so do filmmakers. And you say, oh, this community is getting along, it's great. But is that masking the real conversation of what dialogue is not bringing to you? Not to say that civic discourse isn't the way out, but the idea is like, whose voice do we need to amplify before we even get to the dialogue? And I think that's what art does, right? And that's why we talk about allyship, because you're inherently talking about amplifying the voices of those who don't even have power in a dialogue. I mean, let alone what comes out of a dialogue and how it's implemented. I mean, those things one doesn't even talk about. One just talks about getting the 2 parties to the table. And even there, whose voice matters and whose doesn't. Art also needs to think about that, I'd say.
Yeah.
We are getting close to the end. Maybe we have time for one more question, but also to remind everyone watching that we have a Zoom chat after, so you're welcome to link into this conversation, and so we can see and hear your voices and face. So this last question's from a student. How do you think social media comes into play when it comes to taking action to address the various problems the world faces? Is it generally positive, negative, or neutral influence?
Oh, I have a lot to say about social media. I think especially I don't know if everyone's seen Social Dilemma. I think technology can be incredibly irresponsible. It really is something that we have not accounted for because it's relatively new to us as a medium, as well as a language that we have not quite understood, and we don't know if we're fluent in it. We know how to occupy its space, but we do not know how to be mindful of the bias it brings into play just by virtue of it offering the platforms it offers, because it's not free for all. It's not an actual stage of equity. The stage is very skewed by the algorithms that are running it, and the machine learning that is happening behind the scenes that you're not really mindful of. The brain that gave rise to those 2 living dynamic things that are constantly taking inventory of how people are showing up on it and leveraging that and using it against the very people who are showing up on it is something that we don't really know how to deal with. And I think with Social Dilemma, at least that conversation's been put out there. But if you see the first 10 minutes of that documentary, none of those people could make direct eye contact and take genuine ownership of what has transpired. And I think that is, again, out of sight, out of mind is one part of it. But the other part is that it's all hidden. You don't really see it, so you don't think it's anybody's fault. It's just the way the world is. The world doesn't just get somewhere. It gets where it has the state of tribalism and the skewed factions that have arisen because of social media, is because of algorithmic, systematic, programmatic bias. And it's been come into play. Like, even if you look at, new platforms like Clubhouse that I've been on, the early adopters get more followers. Their voices are more pronounced on the platform. And that the early adopters happen to be mostly male because they were friends of the founders. And they have a colossal platform and a huge followership. And compared to the new clubs that are emerging, where finally the club is even accessible, or the platform is even accessible to the diversity of voices that should be heard. So it's systematically exclusive, and then it continues to empower certain voices repeatedly, underscoring their messaging repeatedly. And we're not conscious of this because we think tech is a level playing field. We think internet should be as democratic as possible because that's what the internet promises, but it's not actually delivering what it promises. That's part of the reason why I'm also doing the tech space, is because I really think tech needs to be, it can be applied for so much good, but it's not being applied in those ways. And I really do think we need to level that playing field. And as Diksha was talking about, whose voices are being heard and why are they being heard so loudly, and are the other voices just forgotten about? Are they being considered? Are you even conscious and taking ownership of the bias you've put into place as a platform? And a lot of platforms don't even acknowledge that, right? So I think that's something that we should talk about. And it would be wonderful almost if we could see a real-time ticker, like on Clubhouse or any of these platforms, that shows what voices are speaking and how often, and how much amplification that their messaging gets versus the voices that are heard. How many women speak, how many women moderate versus how many men are moderating the forums. It would be absolutely devastating to see, even with a study with the National Geographic that we did, for every 11 articles that were written by the magazine, only one was written about a woman, and even that was written by a man. So you just don't see it, but it's prevalent, it's in everything. And we should at least acknowledge and take ownership of that from each platform, from each media house that we are running, because it is an inherent bias that is going unsaid, and it is silence and violence if you do that, so that's something I just had to highlight.
Wow, this could be its own panel, I think, this topic you just touched on. And I hate to be the one to say we have to stop now, but we've gotten to the end here of our panel. But again, please stay on and join us for the Zoom chat. Thank you all for joining us today, and a very special thanks to all of our speakers. They volunteered their time to be with us today. And if you would like to support them and learn more about their work, you can find their books, their podcasts, social media accounts, all the things related to them on the CWA website. So please do that. And again, please join us for the discussion. And finally, I just want to take a moment to send some gratitude to all of the people behind the scenes who have made this extraordinary conference happen each year. Especially even during this global pandemic. Many of them volunteer their time, many of them. But of course, there are also some direct costs that are involved in putting this together. So CWA relies on your generosity to cover these costs. So please consider making a gift to the CWA, which can also be done on the website, www.colorado.edu/CWA. Today is the last day of CWA, so if you missed any events, please check out the recordings on the CWA YouTube channel. Thank you again for joining us. We'll see you again soon.